Welcome back to Book Rake. In this video, we are talking about books about female outsiders, women on the edge of society. And the reason that we're talking specifically about women in this video is because there's actually a really interesting difference when you look about books about outsiders depending on the gender of those characters. So there's actually already quite a trope when it comes to male outsiders in books that have gone down as classics. So for example, The Stranger, The Outsiders, East of Eden. Also you can look at movies, classic films like Rebel Without a Cause, and you'll find this archetype of the male outsider who poses a threat to the existing society. These men are seen as rebels and they come in with the power to shake things up. On the flip side, when you look at books about female outsiders, you'll find that often portrayed quite differently, but in an equally interesting way. So these female outsiders aren't usually seen as a threat. They are just seen as not fitting in. They're seen sometimes as slightly unusual, perhaps slightly difficult women who are breaking the mold. And so they are forced to explore their environments a little bit more, and the books are really interesting in showing the limitations of their environment and of their society. So they're forced to explore their environments a little bit more, perhaps, than the male outsiders do, who just come in and change things. And the books are really interesting for showing the limitations of their environments and their societies. So to explore that a little bit further, I'm going to recommend some really interesting and quite a varied range of books about female outsiders. So starting with Lustre by Leilani, this one has been huge. It is newly out in paperback and there is a film adaptation of this one coming as well. So it's a very talked about book. And this is about a main character called Eyre, who is an outsider in several different environments. So at work, she is the only black woman at her office, her all-white office, and so she finds herself on the edge of that environment and forced to mould herself a bit to fit herself into this career that ultimately isn't giving her what she wants anyway. She also begins a relationship with a married man who is in a semi-open marriage, and so again she finds herself the outsider on the edge of this family, and it's the man who really gets to set the rules of how that relationship works in lots of ways. So Eyre is this really interesting character who is essentially just trying to survive in these environments, but she's also a very passionate and talented artist who wants to be able to draw her own life onto the page and tell her own story in her own way. Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata is another really popular book that's a good example of this. So the main character in that book does not want to follow the rules that everyone around her thinks that she as a woman should follow. She doesn't want to get married and have children, settle down and have a family. And because of this, and because she behaves in a way that is different to everyone else around her and values things that are different to everyone else around her, they all think she's really strange and they all really, really struggle with that. And that's not to say that she's not an unusual character. The reason that this book is so captivating is because of her as this unique character whose mind you're getting inside, and it's a very strange and fun experience. In Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, Kaya is an amazing main character who grows up seen as an outsider, essentially because she's so independent. She is completely self-sufficient, she knows how to look after herself, she's very intelligent, just not in the typical educated way. She actually has this very scientific brain, and so she can survive in nature by herself. She's pretty fantastic, and yet to the outside world, this is seen as a weakness. She's seen as a strange outsider who doesn't know how to live by their rules, even though actually she's cooler than any of them. Of Women and Salt by Gabriela Garcia follows a whole line of women who all in different ways could be seen as filling this outsider role. So we start from the 1860s, go to the 1950s, all the way up to present day, and meet this line of Cuban women who all are refusing to surrender to the worlds that are trying to contain them. Their outsider status comes in different forms. So in the 1860s, our main character is a woman called Maria, who is the only woman who works at the factory where she works. Everyone else there is men, and so that gives her inherent outsider status. Coming through to the present day, we have a family who are now living in the US and still dealing with the trauma of displacement and being an outsider in this new country. So there's loads of different ways that the women find themselves outsiders and different ways that they learn to negotiate that. Kim Ji-young, born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju, is actually the book that I'm reading at the moment, and this has another really good example of a female outsider main character. So this is a translated book. It's been absolutely massive in South Korea, and it's all about women's place in their society. So our main character here is a woman who has grown up the oldest of 3 siblings, 2 girls and a boy, and the boy is really the only one that they wanted. Women hold a very different place in the family structure in this book. And the main character here has kind of happily and resignedly lived within that for most of her life so far, but as this book begins, she is beginning to act out. She's beginning to realise that she doesn't want to fill that role. She doesn't want to hold that place in society, and so she almost transforms herself into an outsider to try and resist some of this. Detransition Baby by Tory is a really interesting example here. So we have 3 main characters: a trans woman, a cis woman, and a man who was previously living as a trans woman but has now detransitioned and now uses male pronouns, lives his life as a man, though his idea of his gender is more complicated and nuanced throughout that. You really have to read the book to get a grasp of it. It's so fascinating. And all of these characters have their own version of being an outsider, whether it's Reese being a trans woman, Katrina being a woman of colour, and then Ames, I also wanted to mention here, even though he is living as a man, because as I mentioned, he does have a more complicated relationship with his gender than that, and he also, having previously lived as a trans woman, finds himself suddenly on the outside of a community that he used to feel part of. And the plot here revolves around Katrina, the cis woman, becoming pregnant, and all 3 of these characters trying to navigate a way to raise the child together in this kind of unconventional family unit. So trying to fit in with rules that society has set, but navigating their own way around it as these different outsider characters. There are lots of great classics that centre the female outsider character. So Jane Eyre is a really good example. Jane Eyre is an orphan. She is an outsider within her family, where she's adopted to live with her cousins, but always treated as an outsider. She's then sent away to a boarding school where she is treated as an outsider for being bad, for being a liar. She then goes and becomes a governess. And in each of these settings, we see the way that she is pushed to the edges and that society is limiting for a woman like her. There's also The Scarlet Letter, about a woman who is ostracised for sinning, for becoming pregnant outside marriage, for being a fallen woman. And there's also The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. That one's about a well-born but poor woman slowly falling from high society to being banished to the edges of society. So each of those classics are really good examples of books that explore the limitations on these characters, placed on them by the world around them. They are outsiders, but they are not given power. Looking ahead a little later in the year, keep an eye out for The Midwife by Trisha Cresswell. This is going to be a historical fiction novel about a woman who is found mysteriously alone, nearly dead. She's got no memory of who she is or where she's come from. But she has all of these strange skills. She can speak fluent French. She knows instinctively how to help a woman in labour, and she has no idea where she learnt these things. I'm not going to tell you too much more about it because there's a really great twist, so I don't want to ruin anything. But again, this is a book that is about a woman on the edge of society, and the book ends up giving this really important message about women's place in society and the strategies that they have to employ in order to survive. Finally, if you're looking for some non-fiction, then In Defense of Witches by Mona Charley is perfect for this topic. It's all about the history of women who were accused of witchcraft, and then also looks all the way through to the present day on the repercussions of that and the ways in which women today are still treated as outsiders for behaving in any way differently, any way outside the rules that are expected of us. Where male outsiders get to be rebels without causes, female outsiders are witches. And why is that? You have to read the book to get some more insight on that. So I'd love to know what you think of our assessment on male versus female outsiders in books. Do you have any examples of books that you think break that mould? Write them in the comments below. I would love to look those up. And I will link here to a playlist of loads of our other reading recommendation videos so you can click through and have a browse. And I'll see you next time.